It is the summer of 1264. In the wood of Bullewell, on the eastern edge of Sherwood Forest, two men ride out under a hot July sky carrying longbows. They take two of the king's stags. The names of two of the men in the hunting party will, within 18 months, be on opposite sides of England's bloodiest civil war in 2 centuries. One of them is Reginald de Grey, a royal officer who will later be paid 100 marks to hunt outlaws in 3 counties. The other is Roger Godberd, a Leicestershire yeoman who by the end of next summer will be a wanted man with a price on his head, hiding in the same forest. Anyone in England can kill him on sight. For the next 7 years, Godberd commands a band of as many as 100 men inside Sherwood Forest. They raid across 3 counties. They strike Stanley Abbey. They beat off the sheriff's patrols. And every single day for those 7 years, those 100 men have to eat. They had no farms, no markets, no bakery, no royal supply convoy. Today we are going to show you what they actually ate. The food systems that fed 100 men for 7 years on land, where every meal was technically a capital crime. Because the diet that kept Godberd's band alive was not the venison feast of the Robin Hood ballads. The actual records tell a very different story. To understand the scale of the problem, you need to understand what forest law had already done to anyone living in the woods. By Godberd's outlawry, forest law had been the most hated legal code in England for nearly 200 years. Killing one of the king's deer could cost you your eyesight or your manhood under the Norman system. By the Charter of the Forest of 1217, that penalty had been replaced with fines and imprisonment, but disturbing a deer was still punishable. Letting your pig forage acorns outside the official 60-day pannage window was punishable. Even crossing royal forest territory armed with hunting gear could put you in front of the Forest Heir Court. For an outlaw, the math was simple. He was already sentenced to die. Every animal he killed was, on paper, the same crime he had already been convicted of committing. The question was not whether he would break forest law. The question was how he would feed 100 men without leaving a trail of carcasses, smoke, and rumours that would lead the sheriff straight to his camp. And meat alone could not solve it. A red deer stag yields about 120 pounds, 54 kilograms, of usable meat after field dressing. A band of 100 men eating modest rations would burn through one stag every 2 days. 180 deer a year. A poaching operation visible from the moon. That 1264 Bullewell hunt was not unusual. Open the Sherwood Forest book, the surviving 13th century court rolls edited by Helen Bolton and published by the Thoroton Society in 1965. And you will find Godberd's name and de Grey's name and dozens of others, all men of property, all named for taking the king's deer. Jean Burrell's 1982 study, Who Poached the King's Deer?, published in the journal Midland History, with later work in the Agricultural History Review, established that hunters in the Forest Heir records came from every social rank, knights, sheriffs, even bishops. Organised rings used tracking hounds, sold venison to commoners for cash, and effectively ran a parallel economy inside the royal forest. This is the first thing the records destroy, the idea that medieval poaching was peasants stealing from kings. The 1334 case of Hugh of Waterhow's gang in Sherwood shows exactly how this looked on the ground. They shot a hart, a male red deer, at a place called Throwes in the wood of Arnold. The arrow was found still in the carcass when the foresters arrived. The deer had been left to rot. By the time the court documented it, the carcass was, as the roll records, putrid and devoured by vermin. The gang had killed it, panicked and run. That is the real Sherwood. A panicked band leaving a half-rotten stag in the bracken because they heard hooves. So when Godberd's men did hunt big game, They were doing it under conditions where every kill was an evidence problem. And they were doing it with the most accurate ranged weapon in 13th century Europe, the English longbow. A self-yew longbow of the Welsh-English military pattern drew between 150 and 180 pounds, 70 to 80 kilograms. A 2017 numerical study from Warsaw University of Technology, modelling the ballistics of medieval English bows, concluded that arrows from these draws could penetrate chainmail and the ribcage of a soft tissue target like a deer at hunting range. For hunting, the practical stalk and shoot range was closer to 30 to 80 yards, 27 to 73 metres. Every Englishman of military age was required to keep arms under the Assize of Arms of 1252. Outlaws were not using exotic weapons. They had trained on this bow at the village butt since they were 8 years old. For deer, the arrow head changed. The military arrow was a narrow bodkin point built to punch through plate. The hunting arrow was the broad arrow, a wide-cutting head, 2 to 3 inches across, 5 to 7.5 centimetres, built to open large soft tissue wounds and bleed an animal out fast. A red deer stag hit through the chest cavity by a 160-pound bow, drawing a broadhead would typically run a few hundred yards, a few hundred metres, and collapse. The 1,334 Throwies case records exactly that arrow recovered from the rib cage of the rotting hart. Hunters of Godberd's quality also used dogs. Medieval forest records reference the bercelet, a small scenting hound used to follow blood trails after a deer was struck. The 1287 Sherwood Eyre records the case of Alan of Leverton, who used a red greyhound to take a doe at the King's Lodge of Clipstone. But the dog and the bow only solved the kill. The actual daily protein in an outlaw band did not come from deer. It came from snares. A snare is the lowest effort, lowest evidence hunting tool ever invented. A loop of waxed cord or sinew set on a hazel rod spring across a known game trail at dawn or dusk will catch a hare or a rabbit overnight. The Normans had introduced rabbits to the Scilly Isles around 1167, and by Godberd's time, warrens were beginning to spread on church and aristocratic estates across England, mostly in the light soil regions. They were a luxury food in market terms. Set against a snare on a forest path, they were dinner. Hares had always been there, so had wood pigeon, which medieval people knocked from low branches with stones at dusk. Wildfowl could be netted in marshes. Streams and rivers gave perch, dace, trout, and the medieval staple, the eel. Eels were so common in medieval English economy that some monasteries paid their rents in eels. Godberd's Sherwood was threaded with the small streams that fed the Trent and the Medon, and any band within walking distance of running water had a constant source of fish. A day's haul from a working snare line and a fishing trap might be 2 or 3 hares, half a dozen pigeons, a string of fish, plus whatever the foragers brought in. It is what feeds 100 men through a Tuesday in October, when there has not been a deer in the camp for 10 days. But meat, even small game meat, does not carry a band through winter. The actual calorie engine of the outlaw forest was the same calorie engine of every peasant village in medieval England. Plants. The medieval English forest in spring looked, from a forager's eye, like a free pharmacy. From March through May, the woodland floor turned green with the leaves of wild garlic, Allium ursinum, also called ramsons, which still carpets the deciduous understory of southern and central England every year today. A 2015 phytochemical review by Sobolewska and her colleagues at Jagiellonian University, published in the journal Phytochemistry Reviews, documented that ramson leaves carry significant vitamin C, beta-carotene, and the same allicin family sulfur compounds that give modern garlic its antibacterial properties. For a band coming out of a long winter on stored food, the spring Ramson flush was an anti-scorbutic miracle. It was free, abundant, and recognisable by anyone who had spent a single childhood walk in an English wood. The same season gave nettles, wood sorrel, fat hen, and watercress. Summer brought bilberries, blackberries, hawthorn berries, and crab apples. But the season that actually mattered for storage was autumn, and the resource that mattered most was hazelnuts. 3.5 ounces of hazelnut, 100 grams, contains 628 calories. 57 of those grams are fat. 15 are protein. Hazel coppice was the most common woodland management practice in medieval England, and a properly managed hazel stand produced bushels of nuts every September and October. Beechmast from the same woodland fed pigs under the official pannage rites. The 60-day window each autumn when peasants were allowed to drive their swine into the King's Woods to fatten on acorns and beech nuts. Outlaw bands did not own pigs to fatten, but they could pick up the same mast for themselves, store it dry, and crack it through the winter. When the mast failed, as it did in the Great Famine year of 1315, peasants and outlaws alike fell back on acorn flour. White oak acorns were leached for 1 to 2 weeks in cold running water to wash out the tannic acid, then dried and ground. Without the leaching step, the tannins blocked protein absorption and damaged the liver. With it, an oak tree became a granary. Once the food was in camp, it had to be cooked. The same low contained pit fire that medieval charcoal burners used in the same forests, the kind that hid an outlaw camp from the sheriff's patrols, was the kitchen for all of them. And the cooking apparatus, as in every medieval peasant household, was one piece of equipment: the iron pot. A cauldron hung over the fire on a hook or a tripod, kept simmering all day. Water, salt if it could be got, peas, beans, oats or barley if any had been carried in or stolen, herbs from the forest floor, sage, thyme, rosemary, parsley, sorrel, plus whatever meat or fish had come into camp that morning. The result was pottage, a thick porridge-like stew that fed every man with the same ladle from the same pot. A successful pot was kept going for days, replenished as ingredients ran low. Modern cooks call this a perpetual stew. Medieval people called it dinner. The underground fire made it possible to cook this way without giving away the camp. A pit roughly 12 inches, 30 centimetres, deep, fed by an angled draft tunnel from the side, burns hotter and cleaner than a surface fire. Hotter combustion means the smoke particles burn off before they can rise. From a hilltop, there was nothing to see. On the forest floor, you could walk within a few paces of a working pottage cauldron and smell it before you saw any steam. The same pit roasted roots wrapped in dock leaves and buried in the embers, ash-baked whole fish in coals, and spitted small game on green hazel rods over a low draught fire that gave heat without flare. One hole in the ground, 3 different cooking methods, no chimney to be seen. The harder problem was what to do with meat the band could not eat in 1 or 2 days. Salt was the conventional medieval preservative, and salt in 13th century England was a controlled commodity. Salt mines and salt pans were owned by powerful estates and monasteries, and any large purchase had to pass through their accounting. An outlaw band could not walk into a market and buy a sack of salt without raising every flag in the parish. So without salt, they fell back on smoke. Smoke preservation works because incomplete wood combustion produces phenols and aldehydes, compounds that coat the surface of meat and act as both bactericides and antioxidants. A few hours of smoke at low temperature creates what food scientists call a pellicle, a thin protective skin that retards spoilage organisms. Combined with partial drying, smoke alone, without any salt, extends the shelf life of meat from a few hours in summer to 1 or 2 weeks. A band that could keep meat eatable for a week could afford to take a deer that yielded more than a single day's meal. The trick was smoking without giving away the camp. A surface smokehouse produces a column of visible vapour that reads from miles away. The underground fire pit, with the meat hung in a cone of green branches over the draught channel, smokes the meat using the same fire that cooks the pottage with the same minimal signature. The smoke that does escape is filtered through the green wood, the leaves, and the canopy before it reaches the sky. Beyond smoke, the band had a few other tools. Rendered fat could seal dried strips of meat in a clay or wooden vessel. Suet packed around dried meat in a sealed pot kept it through winter in a cool ground store. The technique was crude by the standards of a salt-cured Westphalian ham, but it gave a band a week of insurance on every kill. And a week of insurance was the difference between hunting once a fortnight and hunting every other day. The last layer of the food system was not in the forest at all. It was in the villages. Roger Godberd had a knight named Sir Richard Folliot of Castle Fenwick who actively sheltered him and his band, feeding them, hiding them, passing on intelligence about the sheriff's movements. The calendar of close rolls preserves the 1272 indictment of Folliot for harbouring Godberd. Folliot was not a peasant tipping off a fugitive. He was a man of property and standing, and he was running a deliberate logistical lifeline into the forest. The frank pledge system, the medieval English requirement that every man belonged to a group of 10 responsible for each other's conduct, was supposed to make this impossible. In practice, it failed constantly because rural communities frequently sympathised with outlaws more than with the sheriff. Monastic shelter was the second strand. Some religious houses fed and hid outlaws, others were robbed by them. Godberd's band raided Stanley Abbey in 1270, and a monk was reportedly killed in the attack, so the relationship between forest outlaws and the church was transactional, not romantic. When a house chose to feed them, it fed them. When it did not, they took what they needed at sword point. Travellers gave the third strand. A successful ambush on the King's Road put a week of staple food, bread, dried fish, salt, ale, in the camp without anyone having to set a single snare. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig into the practical knowledge that kept people alive when the world had taken away every legal way of feeding themselves. Drop a comment and tell us, which of these systems would you have learned first if you were a green man dropped into Sherwood in 1267? The bow, the snare line, the forage, the pottage, or the simple hardest skill of all, knowing the difference between a wild garlic leaf and a lily-of-the-valley leaf, when one will feed you and the other will kill you. And if you want to see a deep dive into any of the specific techniques we covered today, let us know which one. We will make it happen. Until next time, stay hidden.